So this camera literally has one issue, and it has nothing to do with the actual camera. It's the name. So let's talk about the Canon R1, and this video is not going to be quite as produced as I would typically do. We literally had one day to test out the Canon R5 II and the R1. So I have another video that just went live on the R5 II, so check that out. But the R1 is the flagship camera, but depending on how you look at it, it's either awesome or a pretty big disappointment. So before we kind of dive into the more controversial part, let's talk about the hardware, because there are definitely some upgrades from the Canon R3, but there are a lot of similarities that are going to be very difficult to overlook. So obviously it's going to be a super rugged body. It is slightly larger than the R3. It's still going to be lighter than it looks, but it's also 100 grams heavier than the R3, and also going to be lighter than like a 1DX Mark III. You do get an extra button up at the top. The white balance button is also on this camera right here, so I think that's why they brought it back, so it's kind of familiar for the people upgrading from a 1DX to the R1. But the viewfinder on the R1 is going to be absolutely massive. It goes from 5.7 million dots on the R3 to 9.4 million dots, so a resolution upgrade. But the magnification goes from 0.7 times to 0.9 times. So you look in there and it's almost life-sized. And I wear glasses, obviously. I hate viewfinders, honestly. They're just not comfortable when you wear glasses. But the R1 is so massive, the viewfinder, that it's the only one that I've ever found pretty comfortable, even when you're wearing glasses. Now, there are some backlit buttons on the back as well. And the AF button also gets a big upgrade. So on the R3, they introduced this kind of a trackpad into the R3. And so you move your finger over this sensor and it kind of moves the icons around like a trackpad. But it's also a button, so you can still press it. Now on the R1, you get all of that, but now the button is a two-stage, like a shutter button, so you can half press it and kind of full press it. I did find the half press is kind of really sensitive, so you might need to be careful what you program as that setting, because it's pretty easy to accidentally press. Now the camera itself is really customizable, but you can't assign every function to every button. For some reason, Canon still kind of limits you to what you can use certain buttons for. Now the screen on the back is going to be the 3-axis flip screen, just like on the R3. The actual 1DX Mark III had no flip or tilt functionality, but I'm still a fan of those 4-axis flip screens, and it doesn't have that, where even if the screen is tilted into the back, you could still get some tilt functionality, because it's kind of annoying if you need that tilt functionality that you have to look out to the side. But I still like a flip screen, and it still tucks in the back away, and then you can tuck it back in with the screen backwards to kind of protect it. Now video is going to be interesting, because in most ways the R3 is actually great for video, but it just had some limitations that made it slightly annoying to use. You're going to have some of those same limitations, just less of them. So don't get too excited here. You do have 6K video up to 60 frames per second, which is amazing, but only in RAW. So if you don't want to shoot RAW, you have to knock it down to 4K, which is going to go up to 60 frames per second. Although 60 frames per second is actually still oversampled. So as somebody who lives in 4K 60 a lot, this is going to be one of the best quality cameras at that frame rate resolution combo. It also uses the same XF codecs or containers as Canon cinema camera, so this is going to mix well with Canon cameras like the C400 that just came out. They also threw in C-Log 2, which I know some of you have been asking for. It has 10-bit 422, and it's just only going to be in log or the HDR-PQ. So any of like the standard profiles or anything like that are still going to be 8-bit. There's no way to change the bit rate in standard profile modes. But thankfully, pretty much every format, you have DCI, you have UHD, you have APS-C crop modes, and even 1080p, pretty much everything is oversampled. In fact, 1080p is oversampled from 4K, which is pretty rare. and you can shoot 4K at 120 frames per second. It's just going to be slowed down already in camera like the R3, and you can shoot 240 frames per second in 1080p kind of that same way. Now, Canon won't call it a dual ISO when I ask, but there is a second clean ISO in C-Log 3, and it's 12,800. And I didn't expect that at all. I kept looking for like this second clean ISO around 3,200, like the R5s and things like that, and nothing. So I decided to just keep bumping it up, and at 12,800, it looked amazing. So this is going to be an awesome video camera for low light. Plus, we finally have a full-size HDMI port, which is kind of crazy. We didn't have it on the R3. It's mini HDMI on this. And there is a tally lamp, and plus you have the faster sensor. So the rolling shutter is actually going to be pretty well controlled. Now let's talk about the sensor, because I think this is probably with the R1 the most controversial aspect. So it is essentially the same resolution as the Canon R3. It does have a new processor, so you get faster frame rates, but it still feels like an R3 Mark II or just an R3 upgrade. It doesn't do anything that the R3 doesn't do. It just does all of those things kind of slightly better. So it's 24 megapixels. It can pull off 40 frames per second in electronic shutter. This could only do 30. And you still have a mechanical shutter, although it's going to be 12 frames per second, which is actually slower than like a 1DX. These were, I think, 16. So I was kind of surprised by that one, but Canon claims that the readout speeds from the electronic shutter are basically the same speed as a mechanical shutter. So they seem to be pretty confident that you're not really going to need the mechanical shutter for anything high speed. Now, obviously, Sony introduced an A9 III a couple of months ago, which also is 24 megapixels, but can push 120 frames per second with a global shutter. So there's absolutely no chance of any rolling shutter on the A9 III. I did find that the global shutter had a disadvantage, especially at lower ISOs, with some image quality things as well. So it'll be interesting to do a side-by-side between that and the R1. But it kind of just feels hard to get really excited about this flagship R1 camera when the sensor is 3 times slower than a camera that Sony threw out earlier this year. And it's pretty much the same as the lower end Canon R3. So I would have put my money that Canon was going to go higher resolution, at least 36 megapixels, to try and differentiate this from the A9 III or even Canon's own R3. It's not like this is bad though. I mean, 40 frames per second at 24 megapixels is the fastest for a stacked CMOS sensor as of today. I just highly doubt that it's going to stay that way for long. And given the cameras that already exist, from a marketing standpoint, it seems like it feels like less than what it really is. It also means that the R1, it kind of stomps on the R3 to the point where I kind of wonder why you should even buy this camera, other than it might be a little bit cheaper than the R1 and 100 grams lighter. But honestly, the R1 just kind of feels like a full replacement of the R3. Now, Autofocus is getting some massive upgrades, including a lot of new things, something completely new, I think, for mirrorless cameras. It is getting a cross-type autofocus point. So back in the DSLR days, a lot of higher end cameras would have these cross type autofocus points. Usually the cheaper cameras would maybe have like 1 in the center, and then as you went up on the lineup, you'd maybe get 9 kind of still in the center, and if you got to the 1DX, you got like 41, which was insane at the time. Now Canon has figured out how to put those on sensors and I get them in a mirrorless camera. Now whether or not this helps, I need to do a little bit more testing, but usually cross-type autofocus points helped anytime you had a very little contrast on an object. So for example, a bride's wedding dress, all white, or a guy's black suit or anything like that. Or anytime you were in super dark lighting with just not a lot of contrast, that's where the R1 could be a noticeable improvement with autofocus. And the amount of tech in this autofocus system is just really going to be next level. So you have a very advanced subject recognition system. So the camera is going to know exactly what you're looking at. So if you're photographing a person, the camera knows where the eye should be. And if you have an obstacle in that frame, it's not a person, the camera knows to ignore it. You can also pre-register faces to prioritize a specific person. And another new setting, so the camera has this action priority mode for sports, certain sports. So like soccer, basketball, and volleyball are in there right now. And they all happen to be in the Summer Olympics, which is going to help. But in this mode, the camera basically knows what sport it's looking at. So it kind of knows how to identify what person to focus on or what to focus on in this frame. Now, since we were shooting 2 of these sports, I actually turned this on and it worked. So that anywhere the camera saw action, it would actually focus to that area. Now, one of the downsides to only having one day to actually shoot with the camera is I didn't realize until really late in the day the hierarchy of these autofocus modes. So if you turn this mode on, it basically ignores the fact that you have an autofocus point on a different subject. Even if you have a person locked on, or even if you have a person's face pre-registered, it kind of ignores all of that. So for like an hour, I just thought the AF system was really jumpy. And then later on, I figured out this was just a setting. And as soon as I turned this off, it went back to locking on whatever subject I focused on. So I talked to Canon a bit because I do think this could potentially be implemented better, but it's still a really cool feature. And if you're basically just wanting to follow the ball or the action of the sport, this is going to be absolutely amazing, because no matter where you're looking at or the autofocus point is or anything like that, the camera will always be finding the action. You just need to make sure that you actually turn it off when you want to go back to tracking a subject, which is what took me a few hours to figure out. And my guess is that you're going to watch a few reviews that say the autofocus system is too jumpy. It's not too jumpy. It's just because they still had this setting on. Now, I think the biggest takeaway for the autofocus system in general is that it locked on the eye of a subject so early. It was a massive difference to what I'm used to with pretty much every camera. I'll do some side-by-side comparisons when I do get it in, but it definitely felt like it locked on the eye much further away than I am used to on any other camera. And because of that, it could be the best autofocus system on any camera, especially for sports and action. Now, something that 1 series cameras have always been great at is prioritizing just amazing buffer performance, and there's going to be no exception to this. Basically, you can shoot 40 frames per second, unlimited, in RAW, onto the dual CF Express card slots. There's also going to be a pre-record function built into the camera. It's basically when you hold the shutter, hit the shutter, the 20 frames before that are going to also be recorded. So it helps you kind of get that timing better, especially when the action is happening faster than our reaction times. Another really interesting upgrade that originated on the R3 is this eye tracking autofocus. And basically, it is scanning your eye, and whatever you are looking at, it's putting the autofocus point in that area. And it's a feature that worked pretty well on the R3 in certain situations, but with this much bigger viewfinder and probably some new sensors, it works much better on the R1. You do need to calibrate it to your eye, and ideally calibrate it in the location that you're going to be shooting in for the most accuracy, but you can store these into the camera. And it works really well in most situations. So obviously, you don't want the camera kind of bouncing around. You want it stable to your eye. But literally in like a split second, you can move the autofocus point from one side to the other just by looking at it. So if you find yourself just kind of jumping around with your subjects, this is really awesome. Now, depending on your eye, it might work better or worse depending on the features of your eye. But it worked really well on the R1 for me, and there really isn't a faster way of moving your autofocus point from one side to the other than by using this. So the R1 is still going to be a long time away. So Canon says late fall 2024 is kind of the best case for this going on sale. My guess is it's probably going to be 2025 before you're going to be getting like retail copies shipped to you. I am positive that the reason we're seeing it right now is just so they can get these out to photographers at the Olympics. Now, the price is going to be $6,300, which is high. It's $300 more than the full retail price of the Sony A9 III, which shoots 120 frames per second at 24 megapixels with a global shutter. Now, what's really interesting is I went to B&H to check the price of the R3 to see how much this is right now, and it didn't have a price. It literally said just put in your email and they would send me a price. And the number that got sent to me was $3,999, which is way less than I expected. Like, that is ridiculously low. So I'm going to put a link in the description, because if you can get the R3 anywhere even close to that $4,000 mark, get it, because it is well worth that. Especially because the R1 feels like an R3 Mark II at $2,300 more, and it still is not going to be out for like 4 to 6 months. So I would jump on that R3 deal, actually. But again, the R1, it's an amazing camera. It's hard to fault the camera except from a marketing standpoint. It has an extremely rugged hardware, the best viewfinder I've ever seen. It's insanely fast. 24 megapixels is still enough resolution for most applications. The autofocus is a massive upgrade. The video specs got a lot of upgrades as well. It has a bunch of new features that make it feel like a 2024 camera should feel. And it's also technically less than the 1DX Mark III. For some crazy reason, this is still priced at $6,500. Although B&H also offered me $5,000 for a new one of those. So who knows? But the other question is if this camera is really the upgrade that 1DX users were hoping for to kind of finally switch to a mirrorless camera for Canon. So this has 20 megapixels and now we have 24, so it does get a resolution bump. The autofocus system, while definitely more complex and harder to use, it is definitely better. The mechanical frame rates are going to be slower, but the electronic shutter speeds are going to be twice as fast. And with readout speeds as fast as like a mechanical shutter, I think we're finally at a point where we can trust and use the electronic shutter for pretty much every application. It's also going to be very close to like a 1DX in terms of hardware. It's going to be slightly smaller and lighter, which is great, with a few extra features. So all of that should be good. But let me know what you guys think so far of the R1. Are you loving the camera, or do you kind of agree that maybe Canon should have just called it the R3 Mark II and maybe gone with something different for the R1? But make sure you check out the video that I just posted on the R5 II, because I'm pretty stoked about that camera. Hopefully I get it in soon. Hit me up on IG if you guys want to see some more BTS and everything like that. Hope you guys are doing amazing. I'll talk to you soon.